Hi, my name is Cynthia Pfeffer, owner and creative consultant at Cozy Barn Signs. Today, I'm going to show you how you're going to take these items from our do-it-yourself kit and make your very own professional and beautiful looking Cozy Barn sign. In your kit, you'll have your boards to make your sign, the furring strips which are used to hold the sign together in the back, sandpaper to sand your boards, your paint and stain, 2 paints or more depending on how many you purchased, brushes for your stain and paints, hooks and wire for hanging your sign up, and a pile of screws for those furring strips to hold your boards together in the back, and your stencil. Some things you'll want from home are a drill, a hammer, a tape measure for helping you measure your stencil out and stencil placement, pliers, a scraper, or if you have any kind of credit card or something that's harder plastic to help scrape the stencil, a screw or any kind of hardware that you'd like to use for distressing, a hook or anything with a point like a pin that you can use for peeling your stencil up. Even a box cutter or an X-Acto knife would work as well. So the first step is going to be sanding your boards. And what I like to do is I like to take all the boards I have for the sign and I just kind of line them up to see how things fit together and to see kind of where knot placement is going to be. Wood's not perfect, and so, there may be some variations with the wood grain or how things line up. So this is a great way to see how things are going to fit together. When you have that lined up, you'll go ahead and take your sandpaper, take one of your boards, and you're just going to sand off the little wispies on the ends. And I like to sand over any of the knots or texture in the wood to give it a smoother surface. There you go. And it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth or anything like that, but you just want to get anything that's noticeably a different texture just kind of smoothed down a little bit. The next step is called distressing your boards. And what that means is you're going to take a hammer and basically beat those boards up so that they look a little bit more rustic and less perfect. Some people opt not to do this step. It's totally personal preference. But if you would like to do it and kind of give your sign a little bit more of a rustic look, you'll go ahead and take your hammer and you will go ahead and just hit some dents into your boards like this. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I've had people go up and down the edges of their boards to give it a little bit more texture that way. You can beat down the corners of your boards so that they're a little less perfect. This would be the time if you had that screw or any hardware that you want to use, you'll lay that down, give it a hard tap with the hammer, and you'll see that texture, those lines appear in your boards. If you do decide to use a screw like I am right now, you want to just make sure that you don't hold on to it when you go to hit it. You want to just lay it down there, give it a tap, and you can move around. And this just kind of gives your boards a little bit less perfect look, a little bit more like it's reclaimed barnwood. And so like I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Some people opt to skip this step because they don't want this look, and that's totally fine as well. Your next step is going to be staining your boards. So you'll go ahead and take your stain, and I like to give it a little shake just because sometimes the color settles at the bottom. So give it a little shake before you open it. And then you'll want to use the largest out of the 3 brushes to brush that stain on. So we're going to go ahead and open this up. And then you're going to take some stain on your brush. And I like to start with 1 coat at first just to see if I like it. Sometimes 1 coat is all it takes and you're happy with the color. You can always build on it if you want it a little bit darker. You can do as many coats as you want. to get to the level of darkness you would like. I recommend letting it dry in between coats. Sometimes it dries to a color that you really like and you don't want to go over it again. Sometimes it lightens up as you let it dry and then you're like, oh, I wish I would have done another coat. So I let it dry in between the coats just to kind of see what comes of it. And then a lot of times your distress marks, they won't fill in, and that looks cool, but sometimes people want them filled in. So if that's the case, just kind of take your brush and you can kind of fill those in. Personal preference if you like the look of those distress marks showing. And when I make a sign that's going to be hanging in my home, I just stain the front of the board and then I do the 4 edges. I don't do the back because you don't see it. But when I'm giving it as a present, I like to do the back as well. And I do the furring strips just because when you give it as a present, those people are gonna see it before they hang it up. So it just gives it a more finished look. But that is totally up to you and totally personal preference on whether or not you want to stain the back. I like to do all 4 edges because when you put your boards together, wood isn't perfect, and so sometimes when it lines up next to each other, there might be a gap. You might be able to kind of see in between those boards. And so it's nice to just have that color in between there so it's not really noticeable that the board is lighter. So I will brush this on, let it dry, and just kind of see. If you feel like the stain is looking a little dark when you first put it on, you can always take a paper towel and wipe it off and try to get down to the grain of the wood a little bit more. So let's say you just put the stain on and you're like, that looks a little dark. You will take that paper towel and you can brush it off and that'll lighten it up. Another option is to add water to the stain and almost make it more of a wash. And that way the color's a lot lighter. You just get that tint of color and you can still see the knots in the grain of wood. So there's lots of options to customize the stain, the depth of the color that you would like. And once you have it all stained, you'll just go ahead and let that dry and you'll be ready for the next step. After all of your boards are stained and dried, the next step is going to be putting them together using the furring strips. So I've just turned the boards over so that the sign is face down and lined my boards up. Now I'm gonna do my sign where the edges are completely level with each other, but at this point you can stagger your boards like this if you'd like to give it a little bit more texture, movement in there. If you do decide to stagger your boards, I recommend grabbing your stencil and just making sure that it still fits on there. So if say I was gonna stagger my boards like this, I would just take the largest part of my stencil, making sure that it still fits on there. Because when you stagger your boards, you lose a little bit of surface space and you don't wanna put your boards together and then go to lay your stencil down and realize that it's coming off the edge because you didn't give yourself enough room on there. So I've had people do some major staggering, which looks neat. I've had people go just a smidge off because they just don't want the boards perfect. And then I've had other people take out a level and they make sure that everything's really straight. So again, this is personal preference on how you want your sign to look. So I take my furring strips and I just eyeball them. I lay them on the sign. Some people use a tape measure and they may measure in from the side. Really, even if you put these strips in crooked from the front, your sign's not going to look any different. But if you want to measure, I would say maybe go in about 4 or 5 inches from the edges. So I'm going to go ahead and lay these down here. You want to make sure that none of these pre-drilled holes are on a seam like this. You want to make sure that each of those pre-drilled holes are going into a board. And then you'll go ahead and take your drill and you'll take your screw and you'll go ahead and anchor down that board just for the first screw. You want to make sure you anchor it down. If you don't, what happens is you go to drill it in and that furring strip will helicopter around and you don't want that. So you just want to make sure that one's down. You're going to go and take your drill and you're going to go ahead and drill in there. You want to make sure that the furring strip is butted up against the board really well. You don't want to see any gaps in there. What tends to happen is if there's a gap in there, then your boards are a little bit uneven, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some people like that uneven look. They think it makes their sign look more rustic, so you can leave it like that. But I recommend taking the screw and actually going all the way down. Once you get that first screw in, you don't need to anchor the furring strip down anymore because that's what the first screw is doing. And I'm just going to go ahead and go down the furring strip this way. And I tend to work on one side and I screw in one side and then I jump over to the other side. I've had people, they go back and forth between both of them, and that's perfectly fine too. And if you see a gap like this happen and there's some unevenness in the board, it usually just means you need to take the drill and give that screw another blast with it like this. And you'll see that board kind of pop up. We'll go ahead and get that last screw in. There you go. You have your furring strips in. After you get your furring strips in, our next step is going to be putting our hooks and wire in so that you can hang your sign up when you're done. So you'll go ahead and grab your hooks. I usually eyeball this, but you can use a tape measure if you'd like. The nice thing about using these hooks and wire is that you have some wiggle room when you're putting it up to hang. It doesn't have to be perfectly perfect on there, so that's why I like to use them. So I just eyeball it and I go maybe about 7 inches apart, and you'll go ahead and take a hammer. You'll give a couple taps on the hook. And you'll do the same thing on the other side with the other hook. Give it a couple taps with the hammer. Just to get it started. And then you will take it and start to wind it around. And if you find that it's not hooking in, it may be that you need to give it another couple taps with the hammer, or it may be that you're on a knot and you need to move over a little bit. Either way, once you feel it kind of hook in, what I like to do just to kind of make it a little easier is I take that screw that I used for distressing and I just kind of put that in there, and then you can wind it around. And I like to go all the way down to where that eye starts on the hook. You want to make sure you have it in there so it's almost just all the threads of the hook are inside the board. You'll do the same thing on the other side. And then you'll go ahead and take your wire, and I like to just feed it in from the inside of the hooks on either side. You want to make sure that you give your wire enough slack so that it's not, you don't want it super taut, because what happens is when you go to hang your sign, it pops off the bottom part of the sign will come off the wall because it's so taut. So you want to just make sure you give it a little dip in there to have a little slack there. And then you'll just go ahead and fold the wire over. I like to take a pair of pliers and go ahead and just give it a little pinch on either side. And then I like to just go ahead and check it to make sure you don't have too much slack in there, because you don't want to see the wire poking up on the top of the sign. Once you kind of check that out and it looks good, you'll go ahead and take that excess wire and you're going to go ahead and just wrap that around to kind of reinforce the wire on there. Wrap that around on both sides like so. And then once you have that all wrapped around, you can even use the pliers to kind of pinch it a little bit more. Go ahead and push that around. And there you go, you have your hooks and wires in. The next step is going to be placing your stencil. So you'll see the blue part is your stencil, and then this clear coat over the top of it is called transfer tape. So I'm going to go ahead and take my scraper, or if you have a credit card or any kind of scraper piece of plastic that you'd like to use, I just like to give it a scrape to make sure that blue and clear are together. Do that all the way down. And then I like to put the stencil face down and just give it another scrape just to make sure they're attached. And don't worry if you see any air bubbles or anything in the transfer tape. you're going to be taking that off, so that's not going to affect how your sign looks. So don't worry if you see any kind of air bubbles or anything like that. Then you are going to take the blue and the clear together off of the white paper, the same way that you would peel a sticker off of something. And what I have found that's been really helpful is just peeling up the whole edge and then kind of folding and pushing on it as you go. And with something like the letter P, which I'm using, there's not a lot of little detail inside of it like there is with, say, like the established date. There's the little E part and the 0 and the 9. So this should peel off pretty easy if you have a stencil that doesn't have a lot of intricate little pieces. But you'll go ahead and work and just peel this off, and I just like to fold it as I go, just to make sure all of those pieces are down. Hold it down. Peel it off, and then you go ahead and turn your stencil around, and just be careful when it is sticky side up. If your stencil folds in on itself, it doesn't come apart. So just be careful when you're working with your stencil to make sure you don't leave it sticky side up. You're gonna go ahead and lay your stencil down, and as long as you lay it down just very, very lightly, you will be able to move the stencil around. You'll be able to kind of work with the placement of it. I like to use the lines in the boards to help me line it up. I don't like to use the blue part of the stencil, because what tends to happen is, you know, you'll measure from the blue part, or you use the blue part to help you line up and it's not even. So if you are a measurer, make sure you are measuring from the clear part, because that's where your painting is going to start. And then when you think you have it lined up, what I like to do is, if you have someone at home with you or even just a chair, give it a little tap at the top to have it attach, and have that person hold it up for you or put it on the chair far away so that you can see it at a distance and how it will look when it is on the wall. Because a lot of times when you're standing over it, you think it looks good, and then when you see it upright, it's lower than you thought it was, or it's higher than you thought it was. And so I really recommend not skipping this step. Once you think you have it placed where you want it, you check it out and you're good with the placement of it, what you will do is you will push the whole thing down. Make sure that it's attached on the boards really well. And then you're gonna go ahead and peel the clear off and leave the blue on the wood. So same thing as you're pulling it, you wanna just make sure that nothing blue comes up with it, that it's all staying on the wood. I like to pull parallel with the transfer tape as opposed to upward, because sometimes you can pull things off, but pulling parallel and pushing it down just keeps it on the wood there. When you're working with a piece that has a little bit more intricate detail, such as this established date, you want to give it a good scrape again. And same thing, I like to put it face down, give it another scrape. You'll peel that blue and clear together off of that paper. And then same thing, you're going to want to fold and push as you go. And you'll notice sometimes this will happen where the blue wants to come up. Resist the urge to take your nail and just push it down. What I like to do is just to take the white, push on the paper, and push it back into place. So same thing, if that happens, push on the paper as opposed to trying to peel it yourself. When you try to peel it yourself, what tends to happen is that piece might come off, or it folds in on itself, or it goes down into the wrong spot. This way, if you fold and go, things stay where they're supposed to be. Go ahead and keep folding. Make sure that's down. And then I'm gonna actually leave this to show you guys. If you happen to peel something off and you realize, like, oh my gosh, the inner part of the 9 was left on there, that's okay, don't worry about it. What we'll do is we'll get this stencil placed, and then we will take this piece and pop it back in. So if this happens, just keep it, don't throw it away. You can pop it back in and it's no problem whatsoever. So I'm going to go ahead and place this established date on there. Same thing, you want to line it up, you want to make sure, give it a little tap. You can move it around if you need to. Have someone hold it up for you, put it in a chair, and see from far away how it's looking, where it's lined up. I'm going to leave it here, and you're going to push that whole thing down, making sure it's attached in there. And then you're going to go ahead and peel that transfer tape off while leaving the blue on there. Same thing, you don't want to see any little pieces coming up. You want to make sure that all that blue is staying down. And then once you get this whole thing peeled off, then you will go back to this piece of paper that has that 9 that came out, and you'll just take that little piece off and you'll just pop it right back in there. And you can move it around if you need to, because you can peel it off. But that way you can put that piece back in and it's no problem whatsoever if that happens. And then you have your stencils placed. So once you have your stencil placed, you can go ahead and start painting. This specific sign that I'm making is the family name sign. So it actually has some layering. So I laid down the letter P, and then the name will go over it after you have this painted and peeled. So you don't need your second stencil just yet. We're gonna go ahead and get started with what we've placed so far. So you go ahead and take your paint. I like to just give it a little shake in case there's any separation with it. You'll go ahead and open that up, and then you'll take one of the smaller brushes, and I like to dip into the paint and get a little bit of the excess off of the paint before you start painting. My best tip I can give you is less is more with the paint. Also, when you get started, if you notice sometimes boards can be uneven, and if you go really, really lightly with the paint, it should be fine. But if you're concerned about paint possibly running under, another little trick I do is I take a box cutter in between the board, and I just give it a little slice, and then I push that stencil down so that it's laying flat on each one of those boards. But like I said, if you end up going really light with the paint, it should be fine. So you'll go and take your paintbrush. I like to start on a part that isn't on a crack, and you're gonna go ahead and do this stippling method. I like stippling because I feel like you get pretty good coverage with it, and it's almost like you're pushing the stencil down as you work. But with this big letter P, it's very hard for things to move around because there's not a lot of intricate pieces like in this established date. So you can do brush strokes too if you prefer. When I barely have any paint on the brush, that is when I like to go over the parts that are on the cracks. And you don't want to fill those cracks with paint. Sometimes you're gonna see it and you're gonna feel like you wanna get paint in there because you see the stain, the color of the stain through there, but you don't want to let the paint pool in there, because what happens is it tends to run underneath your stencil and you don't get that really crisp line. So less is more. Keep the crack paint free, don't let it pool in there. And you can always go over with 2 or 3 coats if you want it darker, but I always say start with 1 coat and see what you think. Some people will do, they want it to look a little bit more antiqued or washed, so they'll do 1 coat and they keep it a little bit more sparse, and that gives you more of like an antique washed look. Some people want it really solid, they go back, they do 2 or 3 coats to make sure that paint really covers. So just show you again, when you're going over the cracks, just go really, really light. And then when you get to a part that's a little bit more intricate, like this established date, same thing, you're gonna take the paint, get the excess off, and I like to stipple the whole thing as opposed to brush strokes, because sometimes what happens is things will peel off when you're moving back and forth. So this way, you are just stippling the whole thing. Another tip, I've seen a lot of people in my classes try to stay on the inside of their stencil. They go right on that part. Feel free to go through onto the blue, because that's what's going to give you that crisp line. If you stay on the inside this way, your edge can be a little bit crooked. So feel free to go onto that blue. That's what that stencil is there for. That being said, be mindful of where your blue ends, because I've had people painting and they didn't realize that they're going off the side, and any wood that is showing, even the smallest stripe of paint will show up. So you want to feel free to go onto the blue, but you don't want to go off of the blue. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up here. And I let my paint dry in between coats, just because sometimes when you keep adding more paint, it moves around that first coat and then you're not getting the coverage that you want. So do one coat, let it dry, and see if you want to do another coat. And you can add as many as you'd like to get the coverage that you'd like. Typically I do 2 coats if I want something to be more solid, and I do 1 if I want it to look a little bit more antiqued or weathered. Okay, so you would have all of this painted and you'd let it dry completely before you peel it, which is going to be our next step. So before you peel your stencil, you'll want to make sure that it's completely dry. So I just kind of like to look and make sure that there's nothing shiny looking in the light or wet paint or anything like that. So you want it to look completely matte. And when you see that, you're going to go ahead and get a corner of your stencil started. And I like to pull against the grain of the wood and pull pretty slowly, because sometimes when you pull with the grain of the wood and faster, your wood can splinter a little bit. And if that does happen, you can just pop a little bit of extra stain, because sometimes some boards are a little bit more prone to it. But I'm going to just go ahead and go slowly and pull this piece up. See, like right here, I had a little bit of splintering happen because I was pulling with the grain of the wood. But what I would do is pull this off, and I would take a little bit of stain and just kind of touch that up there. Or sometimes splintering happens and it looks kind of neat and people leave it because it almost looks like it's part of the distressing. But that's how we deal with it over here if any splintering happens. This is the part where I use this little hook tool, or if you have an X-Acto knife or a box cutter or a pin or anything with a sharp edge. So you'll want to just find a little corner and get it started, and then you can go ahead and pull that inner part out. Slowly. There you go, you have your letter done. And then with the established date, I just start on the side here. And you'll go ahead and pull this against the grain, so get that top part started. And then you're going to go ahead and pull just very slowly downward on it here. And then you're going to feel like something wrong happened because the inside of the E and the 0 and the 9 aren't going to come out, but that's just because they're their own little piece of stencil that we need to use the hook to pull out. So go ahead and pull these pieces off. This is always a fun part because you get to really see the sign come to life when you pull the stencil off. And I'm going to go and take those pieces, and I'm going to grab this hook, and I'm going to go in and just kind of hook in and get those little pieces started and pulled out. And there you go, your stencil's peeled off. You're going to go ahead and do the same technique we did for that letter P. I'm just going to go ahead and give this stencil a scrape to make sure that blue and clear are together. And in this name you can see there's lots of little details in there. So that technique of turning it over face down, giving it another good scrape, and peeling it off upside down this way is going to help you a lot. So if you're using a stencil that has lots of little pieces in there, you're definitely still going to want to do this again. We're going to peel that blue and clear together again off the paper. So we almost have this whole thing peeled here. I'm just going to keep folding to make sure all those pieces stay in there. And we're getting down the end. Same thing if that happens, that little blue part's coming off, we're gonna just push that down. Or if you don't happen to catch it and it ends up on your paper, you can pop that right back in like we did for that 9. Little space in the 9 there. So I'm gonna go ahead and peel this off. I've had a lot of customers, they're nervous about putting another stencil over the paint. They think it might peel that paint off, but I promise you it's perfectly fine. It will cover and it won't pull that paint off from the other stencil, so you are fine to go ahead and layer stencils on top of ones that have already been painted. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and just place this stencil down. And again, I like to use the boards to kind of help me line it up. And when you think you have it in the spot that you'd like it, you'll go ahead and just give it that little tap and have someone hold it up for you or lean it up against a chair just so you can see how it will look when it's hanging on the wall. Once you have it in a spot that you think that's where you'd like it, same thing that we did with the letter P in the established date, you are going to push this whole thing down, making sure that you have all that glue down really well. And then we're gonna go ahead and peel that transfer tape off again and leave the blue on the boards. Oh, see, like this part right here came up. No problem, you're just gonna push this back down. Push that back onto the board, and then you'll peel it back up again. And again, if you were to pull this whole thing off and you realize that this part of the F came off with your transfer tape, you would just be able to peel that off and pop that back in. So no worries at all if it ends up coming off with the transfer tape. And it happens sometimes. We're almost to the end here. We're gonna go ahead and peel that off. And then I just like to go ahead and push down the stencil again just to make sure everything is attached on there. And if you notice there's any little air bubbles or anything like that, the ones that are out to the edges aren't gonna make a difference. You just wanna make sure that nothing's going to the edge of where the stencil is. So even just taking your nail and pushing those down will help. Because if there's a little pucker in there, what can happen is your paint can run underneath there. So you just want to make sure that that's pushed down. Like I said, this part over here isn't going to matter because it's not where your stencil starts. So push that down. And then same thing, you're going to go ahead and grab a small brush. You're going to open up your paint. I'm going to give it a little shake first to make sure it's mixed together. And you will go ahead and dip into that paint. I like to take the excess off. Starting in a part that isn't on a crack, you're gonna go ahead and paint that just like we painted before. And then when you barely have any paint in that brush, that's when you can just kind of go over all those parts that are on a crack. So after your stencil is all dry and you look and make sure that the paint is matte, there's nothing shiny or glistening in the light, you are ready to go ahead and pull that stencil. And again, you want to make sure that you are going slow and against the grain of the wood, not with the grain, just to help with splintering. I'm going to go ahead and just get that top part started here. And you'll see here, because we didn't fill the cracks with paint, you get this really nice line that is nice and crisp, as opposed to like paint running underneath. So that's the best step, and I'll probably repeat it 500 times in this video. Less is more with the paint, and don't fill the cracks with paint. So once you get the majority of this peeled, you'll go and take your hook or your pin or box cutter, and we're gonna go ahead and just peel off those little parts that are inside the letters. Off there. And then when something's on a crack, I just like to put a pin or the hook underneath there to pull it off. Pull off a couple here. And then if you notice, sometimes when you go to use a hook or a pin, you might get a little gouge mark. I just pop a little stain into those, and then you don't even see them. And in there. And you have everything peeled. And and your sign is complete. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. To learn more about Cozy Barn signs or to purchase your own kit, visit cozybarn.com, and you can make your very own sign that's made with love and made by you. We would love to see what you've done, so please feel free to post your creations on my Facebook page, Cozy Barn Signs.